Hello. I think we're going to get started. Good evening. Welcome, everybody. I'm Yuri Masny, the Assistant Dean of the School of Art at the Cooper Union, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everybody to tonight's talk. For the past 6 years now, we've had the honor of collaborating with the Public Art Fund to host this series at Cooper. As you may know, these talks are organized around New York City exhibitions that connect the social relevance and transformative power of artistic practice with a wide audience. I want to thank the Public Art Fund for their continued support. We're so lucky to have them as our partners and to share in the common mission of promoting free access to arts, culture, and creative discourse. We have the incredible conversation ahead of us. I'm so grateful to our guests, Cannupa Hanska Luger and Paul Farber, for being with us. They'll be discussing Luger's new Public Art Fund exhibition, Attrition, which is now on view at City Hall Park. The exhibition highlights the deep and painful connections between colonial history, ecological disaster, and human trauma while engaging the heart of governance in New York City. These themes of interdependence and relationality are central to so much of our pedagogy and our work here at the Cooper Union, and we're especially delighted to welcome tonight's guests to be exploring how art making can shape collective memory and evolve our understanding of public space. Here to introduce our special guest tonight and tell us more about the exhibition is its curator, Katerina Stathopoulou. Katerina is an adjunct curator at the Public Art Fund, whose recent projects include exhibitions with Martine Gutierrez, Clifford Prince King, Farah Al-Qasimi, Claudia Weiser, among others. Please join us in welcoming Katerina Stathopoulou.
Thank you, Yuri, for that warm introduction. Tonight's program is part of a continuous series of conversation hosted at the Cooper Union, which aim to connect compelling contemporary artists to a broad public by facilitating a dialogue about artistic practice and public art. Thank you to Kim Newman and the entire staff at Cooper Union for your continued collaboration. First, we begin tonight by offering our gratitude to the Lenape, the original people of the land on which we gather today. We acknowledge the genocide and forced removal of the Lenape nations from their homeland. We honor the many First Nations people who continue to live and work in this region today. Tonight, we have the pleasure of being joined by Cannupa Hanska Luger and Paul Farber on the occasion of Cannupa's exhibition, Attrition. If you haven't seen it yet, it's on view at City Hall Park, as Yuri mentioned, until November 17th. And I really think it's a special project, and just experiencing it within the context of City Hall Park is a really unique opportunity. Together, they will be in conversation examining Cannupa's socially engaged practice and its meaning for art in the public sphere. I'd like to acknowledge our supporters and partners who make Public Art Fund Talk possible. Con Edison, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. We'd like to thank our board, the entire Public Art Fund team, especially Gabriela Lopez Dina, the Associate Curator of Public Practice. We thank our presenting partners, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the leadership support team for Attrition, including Garth Green and Gallery, Jennifer Harris, Elizabeth Pepperman and Richard Pepperman, with the champion support of Ellen and Andrew Chelly, Angelo K.H. Chan, Frederick Wertheim, Allison and Paul Russo, David Wine, and Michael P. McKinney. Generous support from Becky Goshman and Linda Lennon and Stuart Baskin, and the major support from Ruthard Murphy. And now, to briefly introduce our speakers for tonight, Cannupa Hanska Luger is an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes and is Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara, and Lakota, an identity that deeply informs his work in sculpture, installation, performance, and video. His bold style of visual storytelling presents new ways of seeing our humanity while foregrounding an indigenous worldview. Luger's work was recently on view at the 2024 Whitney Biannual, and in recent years he's had significant fellowships, including the Soros Award Fellow, Guggenheim Fellow, Creative Capital Fellow, and the Smithsonian Arts Research Fellow. He was also the first recipient of the Museum of Art and Design's 2018 inaugural Burke Prize, among many others. Paul Farber. Paul is the director and co-founder of Monument Lab. He's amongst the nation's thought leaders on monuments, memory, and public space. Farber's curatorial and collaborative work include Beyond Granite, Pulling Together, which is the first curated multi-artist public art exhibition on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and Declaration House in Philadelphia's Independence National Historic Park. Farber is host and creator of the podcast series The Statue, which is on NPR. He is also the senior research scholar at the Center of Public Art and Space at the University of Pennsylvania and holds a PhD from the University of Michigan. He currently serves on the board of trustees of the Andrew Mellon Foundation and the board of directors of A Long Walk Home. Please join me in welcoming them tonight. We will have approximately a 40-minute conversation to allow for time for a Q&A, so we would love to hear from you at the end and hopefully have a fruitful and productive conversation.
Hello.
Hello. Greetings.
Dosha Maragoa. Dishkagna Hudosha, Nitwe Hudosha, Cannupa Hanska Luger. I'm Awachem Dripping Earth Plant from the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes. Also Lakota and many other things that made it into North Dakota.
We are here tonight. It's such a treat to be here with you in celebration in moment of your installation with Public Art Fund, Attrition, and also in conversation with your long-term work in memorializing bison, buffalo. And behind us, you'll see a rotating set of images that include your work, include images of Americana, and also images taken as recently as a few hours ago. Can we just start, and we'll see this in rotation, but start with sharing, what did we do today?
Woke up in the morning, 11 o'clock, met with Paul. You came in this morning from Philadelphia. We met up and we went hunting for buffalo in Manhattan. And we were like, I know they're all over the place here. There are two locations specifically that I wanted to go and see, one of which was our first stop on our exploration, which was the Cliff Dwelling, which is a building built in 1916. 1916. And it is a, did we say Nouveau? Art Deco architecture of that time. And it uses all of these like indigenous motifs as reliefs on the building. And I had come across it working on another project around building a monument to this idea of dominion. And I was really interested in the kind of architectural style of Deco. Also, the period in which that was in vogue seemed relevant to my experience and the experience of like colonialism, Western expansion, all of this sort of stuff that wasn't that far away from like first contact for my people, or not first contact, but first exposure to mass contact. 1916 seemed, it's in the 20th century, so it seems close and yet seems far away. And I think about the history of colonialism in America and the Americas, and the visual motifs that are on this building is like, a combination of plains imagery, Mesoamerican imagery. There even seems to be a little bit of a nod towards Polynesian visual language. And I was kind of fascinated with like how does this much historical knowledge get reduced to these simplified forms, and how is that reinforced over and over and over again, And so but a major component to that were these corner pieces that were buffalo skulls, and over the main entryway is a relief of a fleshed bison head,
That was stop one.
that was stop one. Yeah. From there, we went to the Natural History Museum. I have two kids, so my exposure to museums is really through their lens and their filter. But my gut impulse in museums is there's a photograph of me, and I am looking at this thing like this, and I was like, my body language is really kind of saying it all about being here. And we're looking at the dioramas from the North America. What is it called? The room?
North American mammals.
North American mammals. I am a mammal from North America and have been primarily omitted from that landscape. And what you see are just these this reinforced notion of a hinterland, this wild America. And yeah, just that omission. And also there is a subconscious kind of experience that I have the privilege of growing up in North Dakota, which has never been said out loud anywhere. But I have the privilege of growing up in North Dakota and growing up on a cattle ranch and being exposed to bison on the land, as well as many other animals that were represented in the museum. And I started to think about this isn't normal or average to the general population, maybe primarily here in urban centers. Who does it serve? Who does the museum serve? And then I started looking at it a little bit deeper. And this is my first time actually in that section of the museum. And I had a weird epiphany while I was there. One of the cows has these anomalous horns that's been taxidermied. And her horns curl in this very specific way. And I was like, dude, I've seen American traditional tattoos with that horn style, and it always bothered me because I was like, those don't look like buffalo horns, those look like cow horns or something, And I found the source material, and it's at the museum, which I was like, wow, I get why you chose that one. It looks different from all of the others, But the perpetuation of that is the artifact of observation, And I'm kind of fascinated with how that happens. Yeah.
Okay, stop three.
Stop three. Okay, so we had a limited time, and the third place that we wanted to go, which is a place I had never been, which is the Bronx Zoo. And I was like, I don't even know if I've ever been to the Bronx. And it sits in my head from hip hop from the 90s, And on our way there was an acknowledgement and recognition of that. But we weren't sure if we were going to make it and get here on time. But the speed at which we experienced both the facade of this building and the museum was just my pace. I'm like, can we get in, get out? I don't want to traverse it too long. And we're like, we can go to the zoo. I was like, do I want to go to the zoo? I don't know. But after seeing these reliefs of skulls and these taxidermied representations of bison, I was like, please, let me see a living one, even if it is in the zoo, So we got in a car and drove to the Bronx Zoo and had a really kind of cool experience there, engaging with buffalo alive as a representation of themselves, and then also thinking about the weirdness of the original architecture of the Bronx Zoo, the lion house, the primate house, the bird house. And I was like, oh yeah, at some point they were like, that's not enough space. We should put them outside. And then I was, thinking about buffalo on the land in North Dakota. And I was like, this is not enough space. There's got to be more space for them somewhere. And we got to talk to some of the zookeepers, and they were so generous in conversing with them. And they kind of informed us where they go and also some of the names of the buffalo in the zoo, which was cool.
Gus,
Kevin,
Sofrito,
Mike Bison. Solid. Yeah.
There's a story a bit about why the Bronx Zoo of all zoos, because it, of course, is tied to both the kind of quote-unquote conservation of buffalo, but also the annihilation of buffalo.
Yeah.
And but I'm curious, like there was a moment that we were there and you acknowledged the buffalo there. And I'm curious if you would just share a little bit about what you said and thought and felt.
Yeah, for sure. I want to take us back just a little bit to provide context to Attrition. This piece is not installed in City Hall Park, but instead City Hall Park was built around this piece, you know? And I'm interested in people comprehending that deep time relationship to land and place. Like bison are here. Bison belong here. They're an apex species. And so I obscured the seal of New York with this work, but also was like, the seal has obscured bison as well. And like our growth, our development has obscured this history. And once again, engaging at the zoo and seeing bison in that limited space. The first bison that we saw was like breathing heavy and sitting away from everybody else. And I was like, what's going on here? And I had this thought, which is, as a tribal person from a landscape that acknowledges and recognizes our kinship with more than human species, our relationship to bison is old. And because of that old relationship, we created a pact a long time ago. And being an ancestor of that pact, I feel as though there is a debt and a responsibility to bison, you know, presently. And I don't know if it's like remnant trauma of like survivor guilt or something along those lines, but it feels, I feel charged with an old debt, you know, that I'm like, come on, let's have this conversation, because I don't think we're going to address the deeper underlying problems until we address what has happened. Now, providing a little bit of context, I'm looking at a buffalo in a small pen in the Bronx Zoo, probably cared for and tended to with, you know, generosity and whatever it takes to keep a species that large alive and thriving. And they looked healthy, you know, where I was like, okay, you're getting around, you're getting cared for. And the thought that I had in my head, and which I projected to, I don't know if it was Gus or Kevin, whatever the old man name of the buffalo that we were looking at, was something that I think about for myself, something that I've been taught, which is like, thank you for being here. Thank you for enduring this. And your ways are going to be incredibly relevant for our future collectively. How you live on the land, what you do naturally, is going to be of great relevance to our future populations. Thank you for enduring this humility until that moment. And I recognize that. I recognize that as, you know, something that my grandparents talked about, you know, that like we endure this moment, but we also survive this. And what do we bring with us? It's important not to lose your ways in the oppression and the pressure of this, because they're going to be relevant not to just your future generations, but future generations, you know? And we're seeing this presently. A lot of my work really actually dives into and talks about like indigenous knowledge as tech that has not been allowed to move through material science, but is going to become and is presently relevant. I mean, I don't know how many green economies are developing that are just co-opting indigenous knowledge without acknowledging the like 20,000 years of proof of concept, you know? I'm like, if you acknowledge the source material, you have proof that it actually works really well, you know? Otherwise, you're gonna try to get support from somebody with like, 5 years, we've been growing things this way, you know, or whatever economy it is.
Yeah. It strikes me in our conversations then you've brought this up quite powerfully, that on one hand, you're bringing forward and bearing witness to an attempted annihilation of the buffalo, and also the generosity of the buffalo and cultural practices of the buffalo, and the fact that we're talking about the national mammal of the United States, and we've seen the seal of the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior. I guess just to ask you about that, like, I don't know if it's contradiction or simultaneity, like how have you approached this question of annihilation and erasure, but also endurance, relevance, and that ongoing presence?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in our collective liberation, right? So I'm looking at what happened to buffalo, and I'm thinking about the pact that generations ago, mine and many other cultures created with buffalo. And the acknowledgement in these old stories was like, all right, we're here, we're in the same place, we both have agency. Your people, this is the buffalo speaking, are kind of pathetic. There's a story of us being just a little blood clot on the grass, drying up in the sun, right? This is a creation story, but the value of this story hides a really important tech, if that's what we want to call it. It's an idea that I think needs to flourish, will flourish. I think the inevitability it is great, but the story holds this knowledge, and the story says there's a blood clot on the land, and it's drying up, and it's crying, and it's singing its death song, and it's just like, not gonna make it, not gonna make it. And a shadow covers this blood clot drying in the grass. And this little blood clot is singing its death song, and it looks up and it sees this buffalo, and she's just like, she snorts out of her nose and is just like, you are so pathetic. Like, you're sitting here crying about how you're not gonna make it, and you're not recognizing that it's amazing that you're here at all. And look at you, like so weak and frail. I have pity for you. And because of that, I want to offer you me. Like, you can take my muscle and make yourself strong. You can take my hide, cover yourself, shelter yourself, protect yourself from the sun. You can take my bones and create the tools and implements in which you will be strong enough to fend for yourself. But we need to acknowledge this exchange, and together we'll exist here. That's the original pact. Then that's not human beings asking. We were just crying and drying up on the land. And a species that was apex, that was profoundly entangled with the environment itself, saw our potential and gave us its life. But that this was going to be a long relationship, and we were going to have to look after one another. That's the old story. The contemporary story, or at least that of 1845 to 1895 through this process of annihilation, is an entanglement in which this entire country participated in that take, but has not made the exchange of repair, an awareness of what was granted. The buffalo gave. It didn't matter what kind of people you were here. It offered its life for our growth and our development. And we forgot the pact, or you were never taught the pact, that there was a responsibility and a debt. And so attrition exists as a first step model into acknowledging that there was a much older conversation here. Older than the state, older than the seal, older than the first people. When we were just blood clots on the land as a species, a pact was made. How do I share this story with our population to encourage us to recognize that and to act accordingly,
And with all of that, we walked the streets of Manhattan and the Bronx and encountered a dozen images of buffalo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I want to get to your artistic practice with this, but I also do just, we're talking about scale, and you noted that attrition is one kind of likeness of buffalo. And I just think, just to put some in perspective, like this image right now behind us is from the diorama at the American Museum of Natural History, and depicts a landscape that is full, that is overflowing with buffalo. And just to have us get a sense of like, what is the scale of the attempted annihilation?
Yeah. I think we're talking about 45 years of exerted effort to annihilate buffalo. Initially, it was inconceivable. The numbers of the herds were so great that people were like, there's no way we can wipe out buffalo, I'm like, tell the passenger pigeon, like tell any other species. But that we're, estimates between 30 and 60 million bison. Like those numbers are hard to comprehend. It was at, let's say 1840, the largest biomass on the terrestrial surface of the earth, larger than wildebeest that you've seen roaming Africa, larger still. And it was inconceivable that they could be separated from the land, but it was also at a point and period of industrialization. And so our collective nation's effort to be a part of the global economy was like, how do we industrialize everything, And buffalo were a absolute, linchpin in our success as a country. You think about what and how bison had become industrialized on the Great Plains, there were multiple benefits. Like the piece there is called attrition, and I'm aware from my perspective that the annihilation of buffalo was a war of attrition against my people to get access to the middle of the country. I seen it that way. But I'm like, how do I relax my gaze and see it other ways? And who else was looking at it that way? And you think about the application of growing up, the initial impulse was like overhunting, At first it was my fault, or native people, we overhunted them, was what I first learned in public schools. And then it was like, well, then actually it wasn't just native people, there were other people who were doing it. So then now it's another group of hunters who were participating in the annihilation. And I think what's missing from that conversation is demand. I'm like, we wanted it collectively, how does that, if you point the figure at who's supplying versus what we're demanding, it changes the power dynamic. And I think as we're moving into the future, understanding those economic exchanges is like the best way that we can imagine and dream the future we want to live in. It's like, what do you demand, collectively? This isn't happening to you. It's happening to all of us, and all of us are collectively choosing garbage. Let me choose. Let me not flex my freedom of choice, but rather submit to the will of the options somebody else provides me. And so buffalo, filled a niche, but the demand was we needed belts for our machinery. We needed jackets for our population. Fashion itself had a big charge on that. And then also, who did we think was successful and what were they wearing and how do we want to emulate that? And I'm like, what's different today? So that was kind of my initial, dive into this. And my first exposure to buffalo was these like old sepia photographs of pyramids of buffalo skulls, right? Like we've seen this sepia photograph. And growing up, I was like, wow, this is an insult to me, and it feels like a show of force, As I got older, I was like, dude, this country does not do anything for nothing. Like, what was the business side? Like, who got paid to stack skulls? And that's what put me into the trajectory of learning deeper around what happens to 35 million, 45, 60 million buffalo bones on the plains. Like, where do they go? What happens to them? Yeah. And that put in motion a whole series of inquiries and led me to different places.
What is one of the places it led you? I mean, you were talking about the generosity, but the take of from the buffalo.
Yeah, well, so those bones were harvested to produce two primary materials, calcium carbonate and bone black. And I was like, okay, what are those for? You know, calcium carbonate, it's a fertilizer. And, you know, if you fly over the Midwest or you're from the Midwest and you see that checkerboard quilt pattern of agriculture across the Great Plains today, none of that was possible with bison. And none of that was possible without bison. Like the bones were given away after they were burned down, turned into calcium carbonate. They were gifted to settler communities who were building farms in the Midwest. It's a slow releasing fertilizer, so there is a geological layer of bison dust across that whole landscape. You know, and it's currently still providing nutrients to the ag businesses that are major economic developments today, you know, across the country. Bone black was used as a pigment. I'm sure at an art school you're familiar with bone black. It's also a carbon filter. So we've got domino sugar, you know. The best way to sell sugar was to sell it white. And the only way you're going to get white sugar is running it through a carbon filter. And suddenly, during this industrial period in America, we had access to tons of bone black carbon. So it was used to bleach or take the impurities out of the sugar. And so it's all entangled. And I'm like, sugar still, you know? Are they using buffalo bones still? No. And we also prefer the brown sugar now, you know? So it's like, what's our demand, you know? And that we're entangled in that.
You know, your work, as we've been seeing it, is dealing with these, the remains, whether imagined, reconstituted. What was your first experiences with living buffalo in your life?
Once again, one of those unique and rare privileges of being from North Dakota. I was born in 1979, and by I would say 82, 83, these programs were put in place, programs in which the Bronx Zoo probably provided stock and material of bison. There was a program that put in play bringing bison to Native communities. And so tribes were allotted a certain number of buffalo, and it became a part of a potential ag business for the tribe. The tribe I'm enrolled on and the one I was born on both got them. Now, my father's side of the family, which is Lakota, we're like cattle ranchers. And when the tribe first received buffalo, the program was kind of centered at the Sitting Bull College as like a ag business program. But people were like, how do you take care of buffalo? Like, what's the business side of it? Like, how do you do it? And so my cattle ranching family actually had knowledge around how to take care of large animals. So we would do like trainings or just like, we want to see buffalo proliferate. So let's go out and help and show what we do with cows, see how it shakes out with buffalo, you know? So one of my first memories of buffalo not being a cow, we were caking buffalo, which is, it's like a power bar for livestock. It's got all these minerals and nutrients, and you shovel out this cake onto the plains, and you call the you do it with cows. You do it with all kinds of things. So we're like, let's apply this knowledge to buffalo and buffalo maintenance. So we're driving out in this pickup out on Standing Rock Reservation, and my dad's hitting the top of the truck, saying, "Come on, come on, come on!" And this is like what we did. We're saying "come on," but we're saying it so fast that it sounds like "come on." And for the longest time, I thought my dad was like speaking a Lakota word I had never heard before. I'm like, "What is come on? What is come on?" He's like, "It's come on," over and over. But you create this response with the animal that, like, look, I'm here, I'm making a sound, and I'm providing a nutrient. Let's build this relationship and association so that I'm not a threat, you know? So we're doing this. And I'm sitting in the bed of the truck. I've got a flat shovel, probably like 5, you know? Like, I start thinking about the scale of age of like me working, and I'm like, dude, that's nuts. But I was probably like 5 years old with a shovel. He's driving, and I'm just scooping out shovels of this cake, which filled the bed of the truck. But I remember where he's yelling, "Come on," hitting the roof of the truck, and probably about 25, 30 buffalo come over this hilltop. And there was a cow out in front, and female buffalo, and she, at a full lope, dipped her head and caught a salt block, which is another mineral, but it's probably like 35 pounds, you know, that was out on the prairie. She comes running over the hill. She tips her head, catches that salt block with her horn, and just flicks it into the air. And it sails like, I mean, it's probably 25, 30 feet in the air, you know, and probably goes like, I don't know, 40 yards or something. It was insane. And at that moment, standing in the back of the truck with this shovel, looking at bison for the first time on the plains, I was like, these are not cows. I'm like, this is a completely different species, you know? And the agility, like they were the same scale, same mass, but the agility was like nuts, you know? And I was like, okay, this is something else here, you know? And I'm like, it was nice to see buffalo I remember there was a zoo in Bismarck, North Dakota, probably where I first saw them. But to see them on the plains, not behind an enclosure, you know, to see them just roaming, to see a buffalo run over a hill, tip its head and flick a salt block, I'm like, come on, like this is cool, you know? And that's probably my first exposure to him, but a unique experience.
Yeah. It's an amazing story and quite vivid. And I know we've been talking about some of the others that you experienced when you were growing up, including kind of the discovery of buffalo bones from previous generations kind of protruding out from a certain kind of soil.
Yeah.
And as we were talking about this earlier, I was thinking about attrition and kind of thinking about, one thing I've been thinking about is like, is it coming out of the ground or sinking in? And just curious about that relationship for you between unearthing, coming back to life, or just the kind of notion of like revealing what is already here and who is already here.
Yeah, for me, it's reveal. Like I think of like a word in academia that I got exposed to was like emergent histories, right? And I was like, oh, I got some emergent histories, that the original design for the attrition piece was built for museum spaces. And I was like, let's cut a hole in the concrete of the floor of the museum and just put this piece emerging from it. Like, how do we allow people to experience a deep time relationship to place? Like, you enter into a natural history museum, and the assumption is that this is old, And I'm like, this is not old. Like, this is pretty new everywhere, let alone in the Americas. Like this idea of a museum, we've run into this before, but around like the subconscious narratives of architecture, like, why do our museums look like Greek temples? Why do our schools look like temples of some sort or the other? who's the God you're entering to revere and submit to when you enter these spaces, you know? And there's never a God in there, you know, not one to be bled for, you know, but rather it has been extracted from other places and tokenized, you know, and presented as an oddity, you know, a curiosity. And I'm like, this is strange. And also the National Mall, you know, our houses of governance, like all of these places, there's this like reinforced notion of a false antiquity to Western knowledge in the Americas, you know? And I'm like, dude, there's dope temples here, you know? There's amazing earthen mounds here. Why don't you emulate that, you know, rather than emulate the other thing? And I'm like, well, because you don't have any source power in relationship to those forms or shapes, you know? No one's going to come to you to worship at a place that exists already. So let me build the temple, and then you have to come to me. You know, kind of narrative. You see it all over the place, and we saw it at the museum. We've seen it in other locations. But this idea of like forced antiquity and imposition makes us think collectively through myth generation in the American narrative that it's been here since then, you know. The oracle used to be there, you know, and we would go and burn incenses to get visions of the future. But that's not the case. So Natural History Museum, a museum, the piece existing in a place is to help people understand time in a different way, you know. And so bones are pretty good for that. It's also, you know, there's a memento mori. We ain't gonna make it, you know. Not a single one of us in this room is going to live forever, you know. And what's our relationship to that, you know? And like best case scenario, compost, you know, that life itself will grow and generate from us. There will be changes, you know. There are incredible changes. There will be things viewed from certain perspectives as apocalypses, you know, as wars of attrition, as all of these sorts of things. But on the other side of it is our survival, you know? So how do we build a narrative that celebrates our collective endurance? And how do we actually dream together the futures that we want to live in, you know, rather than choosing, you know, this or that?
Yeah. And it feels like attrition is part of a long process for you of prototyping public memorials that also function in kind of regenerative sense. And over the last year, we've had the great time of you being a Monument Lab fellow and working on a national war memorial to the buffalo.
Yeah.
And let's talk a bit about it, of why you want to do it, and also just where we are in the dialogue about what it could and should be.
Yeah, I'm interested in. So I had an idea years ago about a monument to the annihilation of buffalo, and this was a big step towards all of the research that I've done. You're seeing over and over representations of buffalo in my work. All of that was kind of put in motion with this idea that I thought was never even possible. You know, I wanted people to understand the scale of the loss of bison. Like, we can barely comprehend what we've gained from that loss, you know. We take for granted the privileges that we have without awareness of the cost, you know. Buffalo paid that. You know, they paid it with their lives. So how do you build a monument to allow our present to understand the scale of that absence? You know, otherwise it just kind of exists as an idea and a memory in us. I was like, our dealing with data at that scale is challenging. Our way to comprehend data is difficult. The best way to do it is actually use our body as a ruler. You know, you can see numbers and it doesn't mean anything of substance, But if you can see what, let's say 45 million buffalo skulls would look like, in proximity to your body as a measurement, the actual scale of a buffalo skull, how does that change your comprehension of the absence of buffalo? Because, we have a collective memory of buffalo, and they are a symbol of the wild America. They're a symbol of something that we collectively want to emulate or at least acknowledge, but we can't really comprehend its absence. So scaling that and trying to comprehend what that looks like, it's nuts. I started to crunch the numbers of it, and I was like, okay, on the conservative side, let's say a buffalo skull is 1 cubic foot, right? And they're bigger than that, but let's say it's 1 cubic foot. How much is 45 million cubic feet? It's hard to comprehend, but I will tell you, I laid them all out flat mathematically, and it covers 1,100 acres of buffalo skulls in proximity to one another. How big is an acre? It's wild. So trying to develop and scale this is interesting. And then I have another question that, as we've been communicating around doing this project is where do you do it? And then I was like, okay, if I'm stacking it 3-dimensionally and it's not going to take up 11,000 or 1,100 acres, how big is that? And then I'm like, it'd probably make more sense to build this piece on an existing hill. And then I'm like, fuck Mount Rushmore, because that's the first thing that I thought of. I was like, oh, now I got to transform the landscape to do this. And then I was like, so you pile the earth, And then I'm like, once again, how much disruption, how much material? Anyway, there's an ongoing exploration. What I realized was there's a lot of ego in the artist's perspective around the creation of a monument. And you've seen it over and over and over again. And I'm like, it's a trap, And I'm like, how do I evade that trap? How do I actually learn from the failures of other folks to consider a different way to do this? And then, where I ultimately fell with the privilege of knowing Paul and working with Monument Lab was I've never done anything alone, ever. None of us have. So we are a lot smarter than I am, and that put in motion okay, I need to actually start doing deeper research. So who can I talk to? Who's working with bison rematriation? Who's working with sustaining prairie lands? Who's turned buffalo into an ag business? How can I talk to as many different people as possible so that whatever this looks like actually encompasses the knowledge of many working within that material?
Speaking of the we, well, I would love to keep asking you questions as I get to do all day, whether here or elsewhere. I want to open it up and make sure that for folks in the audience to ask questions, and just say we have our team from the Public Art Fund has a microphone. If you could just wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you as well.
That was an incredible transition to we.
This guy's professional.
We would love to hear from the audience if people have questions.
And a microphone is coming your way over there.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. I really, really admire your work. I've been following it. I'm architect, I'm Colombian, and I had an experience last year. The mountains of Bogota were burning, and I'm here. And I was like, how come I'm here and not everybody is just completely turned to fix that situation? But everybody was talking to, of course, was working, and worried about, oh, we can't work, things like that. And that really touched me. And I was I've been working with restorative justice as an architect. And last year also, the Supreme Court that was created to judge the cases within the conflict of Colombia granted a river with the state of victim, not rights, victim. And since then, I've been thinking a lot on how, as an architect, I can apologize, because I think architecture has been one of the main collaborators in climate change and in perpetuating disaster.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And I decided to work in a project and try as an architect to help bringing back the ancestral technologies that are kept in museums. And as much as I get into the topic more and more, I've been really struggling thinking about the level of disrespect that museums have for pieces that does not belong there, but actually were stolen, most of them, is so big that I wanted to know, how do you deal with that respect working as an artist with this perspective and working with museums?
Yeah. These are good questions, and these are questions that I've had as well. And like pains. So I understand the pain when you see that, especially if any sort of like customary knowledge around how things are supposed to be cared for, that the museum's model is preservation and not maintenance, right? Like the idea that you could affect and change an artifact in any sort of way is so contrary to the model of preservation, where it's like, let me taxidermy the buffalo, let me freeze it in this moment so that we can all have access to it. I understand that trauma and where I've come and where I've gotten to, and I don't know if it's like me trying to dull my senses or me trying to gain more access to. I was a Smithsonian research grant recipient during the pandemic. So what I got was access to the internet. I was like, perfect timing, In that, I was interested in ceramic practices of Mandan people, my people. Our 90% of our population was wiped out from smallpox, and then the remaining populations were lumped together with Hidatsas and Arikaras to get land during reservation period. And then in the late 40s, early 1950s, they flooded 42% of our reservation. And we're river people. So all of our villages, all of our connection to sites on the land are underwater. They're under lakes, right? And the museum became the access point for knowledge. And it wasn't how it was categorized or cataloged in their place, but rather the awareness that my ancestors were clever enough to embed what is most valuable in these objects in its process of creation. And when you get access to that generations later, not going through how it's categorized, cataloged, but to acknowledge that this is a vessel for knowledge, and your cultural context is the only key that can unlock the value of that. You may not be able to take your ancestor home with you, but what you can take home with you is the knowledge that's embedded in those objects, And you might be the only one who gets access because of all the sacrifices that you made to be here now. The country's on fire. The question is, what am I doing here? You get access to these points by making this sacrifice as an individual. Who wins in the end is what you can bring home with you. afterwards. So you don't get to be there. You don't get to suffer along with the people collectively. You got to do it alone. But you are putting in motion the access point that allows you to bring whatever knowledge you get access to back to where it needs to be. And it might not be the thing, but it's never the thing. These are not things, right? These are reliquaries of knowledge. And they hold the touch and the our collective ancestors were smart. This isn't so refined that you can't see a fingerprint, that you can't see the effort in what it made to create it. And with the right experiences and knowledge, you can, just by observing it, remake it, And that was the original intention, We put a lot of value, and that being said, there are also physical ancestors in museums. I'm not trying to, there's a lot of work a museum's got to do around addressing how it has reverence and respect for the cultures and the objects that they present. I enter into museums where I'm I don't even think I'm supposed to be looking at that, and I don't know what it's doing here. So my experience in anthropological museums is mostly like this, But there is, why are we doing this anyway? And what has been in motion generations ago that gave you the privilege of accessing those points? And I think that there's a way to acknowledge that the museum could just be a time capsule for a moment that they don't know how to unlock. Mm-hmm. But their impulse to preserve is how do we you can't decolonize a museum. You can't change that aspect of it. So how do you unlock what's actually valuable there? And how do you liberate your ancestors? Not if you can't take the thing home with you and return it to the people, how do you take that knowledge from those places and share that and encourage the population to regenerate that, Mm-hmm. That's the challenge point. And once again, it's our responsibility,
Thank you so much for that, Jamie. I think we have time for one more question.
And a very long answer. Solid.
Let's see if I can make the question short, but the ground long. Last time I spoke with you, you were looking for an acronym for Future Ancestral Technologies, and FAT wasn't doing it for you. I think your voice is so important. The scale that you're looking at, the way you go about it, your joy in going after it. I'm wondering about time scale. How are you going to go after this thing about scales? And then might as well throw in that President Biden just apologized from the United States to the Cherokee and,
all of us. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
To all you all.
Yeah.
So what happens?
Off the hook, I guess.
So what comes next is reparations on there. And then I had a third thing, but I don't remember. You can pick any one of those. What are you doing with FAT?
Yeah.
Future Ancestral Technologies.
So FAT, Future Ancestral Technologies.
Lithium, that was the other one.
Oh, lithium.
Lithium, because it's I just heard that all the electric vehicles require lithium for the batteries, and all the places to extract lithium are within 15 miles of of Indian reservations of Native Americans. There you go. Deal with any of those.
Yeah, we'll solve these tonight. Thank you for that last question. I don't even know how to get into lithium, because what's going to happen? The same thing that always fucking happens, unfortunately. And is it their fault? No.
It's the demand.
It's the fucking demand. Get a bike. Don't make me fix the problem. You know what I'm saying? I'm the least equipped, but what do we demand? Can I demand an alternative? Can we collectively imagine a future that is not dependent on some sort of fossil energy reserve, but rather look at what we have collectively done for hundreds of thousands of years, which is like, can you look at the land with reverence rather than resource? You know, can you? And like, do we get there by having these slow conversations around what does that even mean? You know, I'm like, we all know what that means. We have dendrites in our brains passed down from generations before, some sort of epigenetic gift that we recollect what equilibrium looks like, you know, harmony feels like, you know, and we struggle with that because there's a cognitive dissonance in what we have easy access to versus what we demand, you know, and we have easy access to air, to water, you know, to the land itself, the physical geography. And I think this is entangled with bison. Like, why is bison so prevalent in the minds of us collectively? How can we always see this repetition of it? And what is the irony that bison move, you know? And was their annihilation because they were transnational? You know, was their annihilation because they couldn't be restrained in that they didn't fit within the national models, you know? So if we get rid of them all, put them on a nickel, and revere them after their annihilation, then we've sequestered them in a way that we have control over it, you know? And if it's a symbol of your idea of freedom, how can I control your idea? You know, these are the weird things. So lithium, there's a problem. You know, how are we going to resolve it? Our demand, primarily. Without our demand shifting, they're going to annihilate us again. They're going to displace us again. And there's not going to be a moment to say, this happened a long time ago, and I apologize. You know, it's like, no, you did it. No. Scarier than that, I did it, you know? So let's wrestle with that conversation, you know?
Thank you so much, Cannupa and Paul, for being here tonight. I think the conversation tonight has really changed a lot of our understanding about the bison, the history, and I don't know about everyone else, but I feel like I'm going to explore the city in a new way now, just looking for the symbols and the emblems. They're everywhere. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Public Garfun's next talk is on November 13th with artist Adrian Elise Trevor. Please join us then. Very wonderful to see everyone in person.